Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, who is for a Song of Ice and Fire the Miniatures game by CMON. Now these guys form the core soldier type of the Night's Watch faction, and by covering these miniatures we also cover all the different techniques and knowledge you need to paint all the different troop types in the faction. And the key thing about them is the Night's Watch only wear black, so how do you paint an army where everyone's just wearing black and make it look interesting? In this video we're going to show you a great way of doing that, and involves using lots of different shades of black just to mix things up a little bit. So we really hope you enjoy this video, and we'll see you at the next. To paint the Brothers of the Night's Watch, the first thing you need to do, of course, is undercoat the miniatures. Now, these guys are predominantly going to be wearing black, so you could go for a black spray undercoat if you wanted to. However, what I recommend you do is go for a grey instead. So I've gone for Mechanicus standard grey, although uniform grey from the army paint will be just as good. Now, the reason for this is it helps the detail stand out more than a black undercoat does, and this is especially important on models like this, where we've got lots of layers to their clothing that are all going to be mostly black. So it's going to just help out picking out those different layers. And what we're going to do is pick out these different layers of different shades of black. And for these miniatures, I find about 4 different shades works well, and that's what we're going to start out with. Now, the first colour I'm going to use for this is Corvus Black, which is a very dark grey, so a greyish black for this one. And to apply it, you want to get hold of a largish brush. I'm going for a regiment brush from the army painter for this. And as always, all we need to do is get some of this paint ready on the palette by thinning it down with a touch of water so it's nice and smooth. There we go, and then it's just a matter of applying it to the model. Now for units of these guys, what I recommend you do is just vary around which details you paint with the different shades of black to add some variety and a slightly more veteran feel to them. But for this one, I'm going to start with his tunic in the main here. So I'm looking at this layer which goes across his chest and then goes down over his hips down to here like this. Now you'll notice at this stage I'm not worrying about being neat with the other details. It doesn't matter about them just yet because we are going to neaten up as we go along. I'm just concentrating on making sure I get the tunic and following it all the way around on this layer, which will include his arms. And this colour's a little bit see-through, so what I'm going to do is let it dry, then apply a second thin coat in the exact same way before we move on to the next step. Once you've finished picking out one of the layers with Corvus Black, you're then ready to move on to the next shade of black, which is going to be more of a pitch black. And for this, I'm going to be using matte black from the army painter, although you could use Baden Black from Citadel if you prefer. For this, I'm going to stick to the same brush, so still using my regiment brush, and we just need to get a small amount of this onto the palette. There we go. And then, as always, just thin it down with a little touch of water. Now, once again, it's entirely up to you which layer of the clothing you do with this colour, and it's a good idea to vary it from model to model to get some variety. For this particular one, though, I'm going to be going for the trousers. So we're looking at this layer just down here. And there we are, with those 2 shades of black applied to the miniature. We're now ready to apply 2 more. And for these, we're going to use 2 paints from the army painter. First of all, we're going to be using some dark stone and then some Necromancer Cloak. I'm going to be starting out with dark stone, and once again, we just need to get a small amount of this onto our palette. So there we go. And this one's going to be more for kind of like a dirty, more sort of brownish kind of black for this one. And again, we just want to use the same brush, thinning the paint down as before, and then pick another layer of the clothing to do with this. Now for this example, I'm going to be going for this lower layer of robes that we've got on here. So you can see it's this part just here. You can see this colour being more of a brownish one. And this then goes around the back as well, so it covers this area too. And in addition, when you get down to layers of robes like this, you'll often be able to see a few bits of the inside of it as well. You can see some just here underneath his legs. So I just want to make sure I paint in there and get that part as well. And for our final shade of black, we're going to go for some Necromancer Cloak, appropriately enough for the cloak of this miniature. So what I'm looking now is to paint the entire back of the model just like this, now being neat around those colours that I've base coated so far. And with that, we've now finished base coating the 4 different shades of black, and now we can move on to painting the smaller details in the miniature. And the first of this is to do all the leather. Now for this, we're going to start out with some Dryad Bark for all the straps, and then we want some Gorthor Brown as well for some bindings on the miniature. First of all, with Dryad Bark, what you want to do is now switch to a smaller brush. So I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel here, and we just need to get a small amount of this ready and get it under control, just twisting your brush to bring the bristles to a nice point so you can pick out some finer detail. Because to begin with this, what we need to do is to paint all the belts, and on these miniatures there tends to be quite a lot of them. So you can see, of course, there's the belts around the waist along here, so going around there, but also on this particular miniature we've got some leather belts just going across the front of the chest along here like this, and one coming down over the shoulder. Now in addition, at this stage we want to pick out anything else that we want to be this darker leather, so in this case we're looking at the gloves and also the boots as well. And then using Gorthor Brown, pick out any bindings on the miniature, which would usually be across areas of fur. For example, on this miniature, they're down here. And there we are, with all the leather now base coated, we can move on to painting in the miniature's greatsword. And for this, first of all, to paint the blade, we're going to use some Iron Hand Steel from Citadel, and then we're going to move on to some Balthazar Gold, and this will be for things like the hilt and the pommel. Now finally, we'll need some Doombull Brown, and this is going to be for all the leather on it, on the actual sword, which will help separate it from the leather elsewhere on the miniature, and also give a bit of colour and warmth to the model as well. So first of all, we need some Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to still use my medium layer brush to apply this, and again, we just need to use the palette to get it thinned down and ready. There we go. So a touch of water, and once that's done, it's just a matter of painting the entirety of the blade. So we're looking at this area just here. Now if your miniature is also wearing chainmail, be sure to pick that out with this colour at this stage as well. With the blade of the greatsword painted, we're now ready to pick out the crossguard and the pommel using Balthazar Gold. So we're looking at this area just here and also the very end of the sword. Now one of the details to look out for as well is if the miniature has any large belt buckles, pick those out too. For example, we've got just one here that's big enough to do, and that is right here on the chest. So I'm just very gently just pick out a bit of this like that with this colour. And finally, paint the grip of the sword using Doombull Brown. And often with these great swords, there's also a bit of a grip forward of the crossguard as well, so don't forget to get that part as well. And with all those colours applied, we're now ready to move on to our first wash in the miniature, because all these colours can use the same one at the same time. And this is going to be a black wash. I'm going to go for Nuln Oil from Citadel, though you could just easily use dark tone from the Army Painter if you wanted to. And either way, what you need to do is get a good large brush to apply it. I'm using a medium shade brush from Citadel here, and all you need to do is load it with plenty of this paint. Now you can use the palette here to help control how much you're applying at once if you want to, or if you're a bit brave, you can go straight from the pot. It's really up to you. But what you need to do is just load up a good amount like this and then start painting it all over the miniature. And we're looking for it to settle in all the recessed detail on the model. So you can see as I apply it here, just let it run into those nooks and crannies. Now in these miniatures, you will tend to get it collecting a lot in particular areas. So what we're looking for is kind of the inner creases on cloaks and fabric. So if I just put a large amount on the front like that, you can see it really collects in areas like that. So you need to watch out for this, because if that dries like that, it's going to look really horrible. All you do whilst it's still wet is just touch your brush to it to absorb away the excess, and then just leave roughly that amount in there, so it's just a little bit darker in those corners. Other areas to watch out for this happening would be the inside of the cloak, so a crease such as just in there. And on the back of the cloak, we'd be looking at areas such as around about here. You see, it all tends to happen in these areas. So when you see that happening, just move it away like this. And whilst you're doing this, don't worry about any fur on the miniature. You can avoid that because we are going to be painting that in the next stage. Now once you've painted it all over the miniature, it'll take around about 45 minutes to dry, and just be sure it is completely dry before you move on to the next stage. Once that wash is completely dry, we're then ready to move on to applying a few more base coats onto the miniature that are going to be using a brown wash. And for this, first of all, we need to go to Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this is to neaten up all the fur on the model. And then we're going to move on to Baneblade Brown, and this is going to be to paint the Swan Brothers' hair, because we're going to go for a kind of mousy blonde colour on this one. But first of all, what we need is Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I'm going back to my regiment brush to apply this. We just need to get a little bit ready, and then for this, it's just a matter of looking for all the fur in the miniature and just making sure it's all neatly painted with this. So in the case of this miniature, we have a bit of fur on the legs. That's just down here. You can see it poking out from between the bindings, so we just want to paint around there like that. There's a little bit on the cuffs as well, so we just want to go along there. And of course, there's quite a lot of it going around the shoulders, so be sure to catch that as well. And then we're ready to move on to painting in the beard and the hair using Baneblade Brown. Though of course, if you want to change the colour here, you should feel free to do so. And for this, I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel. And with those two details now base coated, we can move on to washing them as well. And for this, what we want is a dark brown wash. So I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade from Citadel, but you could also use strong tone from the Army Painter if you wanted to. Now for this, go for a smaller brush. I'm going for medium layer brush to apply this, so we've got some control over it, because we only want to get this over those two new details. So just use the palette to help control how much of this paint you got on your brush, and then it's just a matter of painting over them. So we're looking for the fur and also the hair. So all around here, just being careful when you get close to those other details that you've already washed. And with that wash now applied, we can move on to painting the miniature's skin. And for this, we're going to start out with the base coat of Bugman's Glow before moving on to washing over it with Reikland Fleshshade. And once this is dry, we'll apply a layer of Cadian Fleshtone before finishing off with a highlight of Kislev Flesh. So first of all, we need that base coat of Bugman's Glow, and this time I'm going to use a small layer brush right from the very start because it can be a little bit tricky to access some of this detail because it can be really hidden away amongst all the hair. So just really make sure you get that paint thinned down so it's flowing really easily from your brush. Just use the tissue to help make sure that your brush isn't overloaded. And once you've done so, all we've got to do is start picking out all of that skin. So all you need to do is just very gently start poking your brush into this area here, just base coating all the way around the flesh, being especially neat when you're painting in the lower lip. With that base coat done, we're then ready to apply a wash of Reikland Fleshshade all over the skin, again still using that small layer brush. Once the wash is dry, we're then ready to move on to a layer of Cadian Fleshtone. I'm still using a small layer brush for this. What we want to do is to pick out the raised areas and avoid the recessed detail. So I like to start on the nose like that, just gradually picking it out. And then you can see we've got a bit of a furrowed brow on the top here. So I just want to pick out that area there, avoid the recess where the shade is, then carry on again on the other side there like this. And then again, as we get to the eye, just skip the recess and then start painting the details beneath it, such as just beneath the eye there, and the cheekbone as well. So you see, by just gradually doing this, we can really start to bring out the expression on the face. It's just a matter of adding a small bit at a time. And finally, we're ready to apply a highlight of Kislev Flesh. And for this, really, we just need to follow the bone structure. So first of all, we just need to go down the centre of the nose. So there, like that. Then across the brow, so just along here. And finally, just picking out the tops of the cheekbones. And with that, the skin is now highlighted, but what we're going to do now is add a small detail to it to give a little bit of character to this miniature, because of course the Night's Watch is based around the wall, which is in the frozen north. So to give the miniature the impression of being cold, I'm going to add a subtle redness to the nose, and for this you just need a red wash. Now, the one I'm using is Carroburg Crimson, which is from Citadel, and I'm just needing a small layer brush to get this ready. All you need to do is get a small amount of the colour onto your palette like that, and then heavily water it down so we get a very diluted version of the colour. So kind of like that is what we're looking for. The reason being we don't want to turn his nose bright red, just a subtleness to it. So having it diluted like that will be perfect for it. All you need to do is just run this onto and around the nose. So we're looking at just here. Let's settle around there like that. And there we are, the face is complete. So at this point, if you wanted to, you could leave the miniature here and just move on to basing it. However, what we're going to do now is start highlighting it, which is optional. But if you want to do it, what we're going to do is start out with those different shades of black and separate them a little bit more from each other. The first of these is going to be the parts that we painted with Corvus Black originally. So in the case of our example here, it's the tunic. And for this, we're going to give it a sort of bluish tint. So the first colour we need for this is Dark Reaper, which is a paint from Citadel. And I'm going to be applying it using the small layer brush once again. And what we want to do is use this to pick out all the creases on the fabric. So to help out with that, use your palette to get that paint diluted and just check it on the palette as well to make sure it's flowing smoothly from it. So for that, what I like to do is just have a go at painting a few lines like this, and you can see it's coming off just fine, so I know I've got it diluted correctly. So what we want to do now is take a look at that tunic and look for all the creases in it, which stand out really nicely on these miniatures. To begin with, go for the edges. So around here, for example, what I'm going to do is use the side of my brush just to skim that edge like that, so I get a highlight there, and then turn the model so I can access this side using the side of my brush once again and just skim it along there like that. Get a nice highlight running around the outside of the tunic. Now as for the creases, what we're going to do is use the tip of the brush this time, and the best way to do this is to turn the model so you're painting kind of downwards and towards yourself, which is a nice comfortable motion. So we're looking at this one just here. All I'm going to do is just run a fairly broad line across the top of that crease there like that. And it's just a matter of repeating this process on all these areas. Remember, this is the part that you paint with Corvus Black. Just follow all the way around that detail. And with that highlight applied, you can see the jacket's just been shifted to have a slightly more bluish hue. And what we're going to do now is exaggerate that a little bit more because we're dealing with so many tones of black. We want them all to stand out a little bit from each other, you see. So for this, we're going to use some Fenrisian Grey as a fine highlight. And this is a very light colour, so we need to be delicate about how we're applying it. For that reason, I'm going to use a detail brush from the Army Painter, which is a really nice fine brush. And we don't need very much of this. Just make sure you've got it nicely thinned down there, and just make sure you've only got a small amount of it on your brush. What we're going to do with this is just pick out the really most defined parts of the creases, the parts that stand out the most. So we just want to get that small amount ready and then start looking for these areas. And a great example would be on the bottom of it just down here. What we're going to do is look for that sharpest corner and apply a very small amount of this colour there like that. And then turn the model so I can comfortably access that area there. It's at a small amount there. So you see it's a very tiny amount, but it just increases the bluishness on that area there. And really just a matter of just continuing along with that, looking for any really well-defined crease and just picking a little bit out. So such as just there, for example, on the elbow, so just a little bit there. There we go. And then on the opening on the front of the jacket, so just there. You see it's always small, subtle bits, but it just helps that detail stand out a little bit more. And with that, the tunic is now complete, and you can see it just really emphasised that bluishness to it. And what we can do now is move on to highlighting some other details of the black. And this time we're going to go for the parts that we base coated with matte black originally, and also Necromancer Cloak. Now these two colours are different enough that we can use the same highlight sequence on both of them, and they'll still stand out separate from each other. So the colours we're going to use first of all are Mechanicus Standard Grey for a general highlight. Then we're going to move on to a fine highlight with Adminstratum Grey, so just like we did before. So to start out with Mechanicus Standard Grey, I'm going to go for the small layer brush again for that initial highlight, and this, like with the tunic, we're looking to use this to pick out all the creases and edges on these fabric details. So once your paint is thinned and ready and you've got that good tip in your brush, what we need to do is start looking for the tops of these creases. So on the trousers, it's going to be much like on the jacket when you were doing the arms. We're looking for areas such as on the knee, so a little bit across the front there like that. And you can see we've got lots of creases on the side, so we want to pick out those as well. Now when it comes to the cloak, what we're going to do is do the outside edge of it, and for this we can actually use the side of the brush just to skim along, and you can see it runs up there, and then it kind of goes up there up to his shoulders like that, and some of it does run in front of him, so be sure to get this part around the front of his head as well, just along there. Again, you can see I'm just using the side of my brush. But on the back we've got all these creases, and they're nicely defined, so all we need to do is to pick out these, just running a fairly broad highlight of this colour along the very top of each. And then to help these details stand out a little bit more, we're going to add a fine highlight of Adminstratum Grey using a detail brush from the Army Painter. And this is just the parts that stand out the most. For example, just on the knee there. And when it comes to the cloak, we're looking at the sharper edges. So on the hem, it's going to be areas such as the corners here, and the little rips that we have at the back, and also any creases that stand out a lot. So for example, this one just here. And with that, the cloak is now fully highlighted, as are the trousers. So we can move on to that last sort of really dark brownish black that we've got. And for this, what we need is some Gorthor Brown, followed by a fine highlight of Baneblade Brown. First of all, though, with Gorthor Brown, we're going to go back to the small layer brush for this. And it's the exact same process of what we've just done on those different tones of black so far. So to begin with, for this first highlight, what we want to do is to pick out all those creases and edges. So once you've got the paint ready, it's just a matter of looking for those parts and, well, painting along them. So for example, on this part of the fabric we've got here, this crease is a great area to highlight, so we just want to go along there and then just turn the model again so it's just comfortable to follow along that raised area until we get a nice highlight along like that. And in addition, we want to look for the hem of this part of the fabric, so that's going to be running along there like that and along here. Now at this stage, if you want to highlight the belts, this is a great colour to do that with as well, same as the boots and the gloves. Once again, just look for the parts that stand out and just run your brush along them. So in the case of the belt, it's going to be along the edges like this. On the hands, it'll be along the fingers. So for example, along here. And then finally, we're ready for that finer highlight of Baneblade Brown on these details. So anywhere you painted with dark stone originally, using the detail brush just to pick out all the sharpest edges, just like we were doing with those previous highlights. Now in addition, at this stage, we can add a fine highlight to these bindings that we did earlier on using Gorthor Brown. And for these, it's just a matter of painting a few lines just to pick them out like this. And with those highlights applied, the model is very nearly finished. However, there's just one more thing that we're going to do on the black, and this is just going to deepen the recesses of it and give a bit more contrast against the highlights, which appropriately enough is going to involve some contrast paint. Now the one I'm going for here is Black Templar, and to apply it I'm going for a small layer brush from Citadel. And what I'm going to do with this is dilute it first of all with some water, because this paint's very strong straight out of the pot. So I want to get a full brush full, put that next to it and start and put them together like that. And I'm looking for sort of this sort of strength. So you can see if I really put it thinly, you can see it's more of kind of like a grey just there. You can see through it a little bit. So that's what we want to get for there. And then load up your brush with some of this. And what we're looking to do is to paint this into some of the deeper recesses to, well, deepen them, you see. So on the back of the cloak here, for example, what I'd do is paint this into the bottom of the creases. So along there and then along there. Now, whilst it's still wet, quickly wash your brush to make sure it's damp. And then on either side, just paint along it like that. And what that'll do is just blend that black Templar into the surrounding area. So by doing this, what you get is a nice smooth shading in the very deepest areas like that, just giving them a bit more volume, you see. So now it's just a matter of doing this on all these black areas, such as the crease up there, on the side there, and even on the other shades of black too, if you want to. And I'm definitely going to be doing it on this brown area just here, just to bring it a little bit closer towards black. And with that, all of those black details are now complete. And now I can move on to painting some of the smaller details on the miniature, the first of which is to complete that greatsword. Now for this, we'll need some Stormhost Silver first of all to highlight the blade, followed by Liberator Gold to highlight those brass details, and then finally some Tuskor Fur, and this is going to be for the grips of the sword. But first of all, we need that Stormhost Silver, and for this I'm going to be using the small layer brush from Citadel, and for this we just want to highlight the sharpest edges on the blade. So for this, just make sure that paint's nicely diluted, and then what we're looking to do is to, first of all, to turn your brush sideways on like this, and then just skim it across that raised texture of the blade like that, so you get a nice highlight following those two edges, and then down to the center point just there. Then for the actual cutting blade itself, just turn it on its side and just run all the way around there like that. Now in addition, at this stage, if you want to pick out any little rivets and chainmails and things like that, this is a good time to do it. So for example, these little studs we've got just there, all I want to do is just gently pick them out like that. And if you've got some chainmail in your miniature, just lightly run your brush across the raised texture to highlight the raised parts of it. Next, we're ready to highlight the crossguard and the pommel using Liberator Gold. And once again, we just want to look for those edges and just pick them out very gently using a small layer brush. Now also at this stage, we're ready to finish off all the buckles on the miniature, and this includes the larger ones which we base coated earlier on, such as the one on the chest, but also look for any smaller ones and be sure to pick them out at this stage as well. And then finally, we're ready to highlight the grips of the sword using Tuskor Fur, and for this, all you need to do is just paint some lines running along the grip just like this to give the impression of the texture of the bindings. And with that, the greatsword is complete, and in fact the model is very nearly finished. We've just got two more things left to complete. And first of all, that involves the fur, for which we'll need some Baneblade Brown, which we're going to dry brush on it, and then lightly dry brush it with a shabty bone to finish it off. And then finally we'll need to paint the hair, and for this all we need is some Agrax Stone. But first of all, we need to do that first. So I'm going to start out with Baneblade Brown, and I'm going to be applying this using a medium layer brush, dry brushing it slightly differently from how I normally do it. So we just need to load some of this on the brush like that, work it into the bristles, and then the tissue, just brush it very lightly like this, just to get rid of the excess paint. Because what we want to do is very lightly apply this to that raised texture now. So for the fur, what we're going to do is hold the brush side on and just start running it down it like this, just gradually building up the colour. This way you see you get a nice highlight on there, but it's easy to control, and this way we can avoid those other details on the miniature. Now it's also going to be the same when it comes to doing areas such as around the wrists. So make sure you don't have much paint on your brush and just very lightly run it across it like that, just to catch that raised texture. Once you finish with the Baneblade Brown, we're then ready to move on to a shabty bone, which I'm going to be applying in just the same way, only just a little bit lighter to get a nice highlight to finish off that fur. And finally, we're ready to highlight the hair using some Agrax Stone applied with a small layer brush. And for this, I'm just going to use the side of my brush just to skim the raised texture to give it a nice quick highlight like this. Now with this done, the miniature is ready to be based. And as always, it's entirely up to you exactly how you base it. But for me, I'm going to go for a grasslands base with a little bit of snow on it. And with the base now fully painted, this sworn brother is ready to fight in defence of the wall, protecting the realm. So as you've seen, painting these miniatures is actually very straightforward, but the key thing to do is to use those different shades of black to provide a different texture for the various different elements on the miniature, and also help those details stand out. Now when you're painting a lot of these models, what we advise you do is just take these different shades and just swap around which details you're painting with them to add a bit more variety to your miniatures. But really that's the key thing to know, so we really hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you all again very soon.